Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Erickson, and I'm going to be presenting my capstone research on neo-westerns, westerns, and film on history. So to start out with, I got two photographs here. One is a picture of George Armstrong Custer, who famously led or infamously, led the American forces at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and that's the one there on the right in black and white. And then on the left there, we have also George Armstrong Custer, portrayed by Bill Hader in the movie Night at the Museum 2. So I kind of chose these photos because I just think it's interesting to show a historical figure and then how they're presented in what's really just kind of a silly representation. And I think it's a good place to start a discussion on history and history on film. So first off, we're going to kind of start by pulling out the big guns right away. What is history? And that's an insanely big question. History is a complicated topic, so defining it is equally as complicated. There's a question, does history involve everything? I mean, after all, you can write history on anything. It can be history of things from movies to soda pop to global political situations. But to say that all history is to say that everything is represented in history is false because there's simply too much information out there, and at the same time, not enough information about times gone by. So most historians are approaching the past through questions. And you know, Traditionally, history has been done through books and through research that has been, presented in the written word essay format almost, even if it's insanely long essays that go for 400 pages. They're arguments about the past, um, which then makes us ask, does history exist? Is history just nothing? As you can see on the right, that's a picture of Napoleon Bonaparte riding a horse in battle, a painting of it. Um, and he has this quote that says, and I might botch this, so please be patient with me, something along the lines of, history is the set of past events that people agree upon. And if that's the case, then, it becomes really kind of murky. Is history just something that we all say, well, that's what happened? And, there's some truth to that quote, and also there's some problems with that quote, because if that's the case, it becomes very easily to slide into relativism to say that, well, it doesn't actually matter. It's part of this kind of ongoing debate about what is history. Um, but one thing that we know history is, that without a doubt, history includes as a narrative. History is a story. It's people and places doing things. This history is it's tied to a story that we're telling ourselves about ourselves. And that's very interesting because for the longest time, these stories were told to us through books. I mean, for thousands of years, that's how we've recorded history. And in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we have the advent of film. And that is something that is going to radically change the game. So my research I want to kind of walk you through is going to talk about films as history. Then we're going to move on and talk about Western films and their complex relationship with history. And then we're going to talk about a relatively new genre that has been around as early as the 1950s, but really became popularized in 2007, called the neo-Western. Let's keep moving here. So first off, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of film. Now, because I have a little bit of trouble with technology, we're not going to bother playing that video that I embedded right up here. Instead, we're gonna talk about what that video is. So first off, we have to discuss. Let's see. We have to discuss French supremacy in cinema. Um, when we get to late 1800s, early 1900s, it's important to know that the American film industry is not like the European film industry. While America helped pioneer some of these things, there is absolutely no way that we can compete. People like Georges Méliès, they really had uh, a stranglehold on film. Méliès was the person to go to for fiction in film. And as far as realism, the Lumiere brothers had a portable camera that they could take around to factories and parks, and they could record real life. So the Americans can't compete with this. Um, what the Americans do have, let's see if it'll let me. One moment, please. Oh, there we go. Okay. What the Americans do have is Edison's Black Maria. So this is a tar paper shack, basically. It's a big black building, and it's designed with this giant camera inside. Thing's huge, not very mobile at all. And Edison records very short videos on this, and he's trying to find a way to market American films that can compete with European films. Which is difficult. This camera doesn't move. I mean, the entire building can rotate to help let light in, but it's less portable, less usable, and so he needs a way to compete, which is where we get to a guy named Scott Simon. Now, Scott Simon is not alive during Edison's time by any means. He's a scholar, a contemporary scholar, and Simon presents this thesis in one of his books on film. He suggests that the Western film grows out of these qualities that America has that other countries don't have. And the two qualities he identifies are Native American peoples and the geography. Um, and so his suggestion is that this video that was giving me a little trouble earlier, it's called the Sioux Ghost Dance. A group of Lakota Native Americans were traveling with Wild Bill, his show, and they were going through New York, and Edison met him, and he convinced him to come in and record on this giant camera, doing their ghost dance just a few years after Wounded Knee, which most historians date as the closing of the West. And that's very interesting because these are people who had experienced that religious revival, and so very soon after the closing of the West, Simon identifies the opening of the Western myth or the Western film. And I'm going to argue that it's history, but a very unique type of history. However, that history comes, or myth, comes from something unique to America that could be marketable around the world. And so that's how Simon identifies the start of the American Western. And the Western story has existed even before the West was closed. But the Western film really creates the Western history of the Western myth. Um, so now let's talk a little bit about film as history. Before we move on, we're going to kind of table our discussion of the West just for a moment. We will be coming back for that. There's this question about whether or not you can actually call films history, which is a valid question after all. Everybody who's seen, movies like Pearl Harbor can agree that this is maybe a little embellished, to say the least. And there's truth to that. I wrote here, old habits die hard. Um, as we look at historical films, so films that are about history, we notice that scholars a lot of times will try and discuss these kind of films in the same way that they discuss books. So they will push for these discussions that try and take and transpose values that we have for history that's presented in the written word and push that onto history on the film medium. Now, I read two scholars, a gentleman by the name of Robert Brent Toplin and another gentleman by the name of Robert Rosenstone. And Toplin and Rosenstone are really kind of pioneers in the idea of film as history. So viewing historical films in the same way that we view historical books. So, for example, a movie such as Glory, the one that you'll see this picture here, that has value in the same way that a book on the Civil War might. But they identify different ways that these can be used. The new medium of film has new conventions that come with it. We can't get the accuracy that we get in a 500-page textbook on the Civil War in a 2-hour film. Um, I had Ferris Bueller fights the Confederates, but this film, Glory here, with Matthew Broderick as the star, is widely regarded as an accurate film, even though there's a lot of fiction thrown in there. There's scenes that are made up, characters that we have no historical record of. So how can this be accurate, if that's the case? And the answer is that it's accurate to the experience. At least the historians who suggest that it is accurate say that. So the goal of film as history is not to capture things exactly as they were. Instead, Rosenstone and Toplin argue that historical films are ways to experience the emotions of certain time periods. And so accuracy is always important, but it's less important in the written word. And that's simply because of how films work. They're shorter than books and they take more money and they have to be more entertaining. And so the narrative aspect can sometimes trump the factual. And so the goal of these things isn't to get the truth in the strictly traditional sense. We aren't trying to get exactly what happened. We're trying to get how things felt and the general gist of an event. And if film is viewed this way, both Rosenstone and Toplin argue that it's possible for these historical films to really change the way that we view history. And that's a very interesting argument. Which brings us to the Western myth. We're going to talk about a gentleman named David Hamilton Murdoch for a moment. He wrote a book called The American West, The Invention of a Myth. And in this book, he's arguing that the Western film, because the Western film, as I mentioned earlier, it really is tied to the creation of the West as a popularly imagined thing. And Murdoch argues that the myth was created almost immediately after the closing of the West because of a need for foreign American mythology in the progressive era. And he identifies people who actively work to create that myth. I have a quote here, and I'm going to read this for you. If we understand this part of our history and our continuing fascination with it, we will better understand how our people see themselves and the hopes they have for America. So, the Western movie, this quote, sorry, it was by President Ronald Reagan, and this was given at a speech in the 1980s, just before the opening of an exhibit displaying artifacts from the American West. And so, this quote, what I want you to kind of look at is here Reagan is invoking this myth, suggesting a callback to values that Murdoch would argue never really existed. So let's talk about kind of what that myth was, or that history. First off, the America we saw. We have to talk about what it was like to view this history, I'm going to argue, on film. It starts with things like yellow journalism. Even during the Old West, there are pushes to really commodify what's going on as America moves westward. And so it's sensationalized, and that causes some real problems during this time period. Um, but Murdoch points out something that's very interesting to me, and that's the nature of the cowboy as a company man. So most of your cowboys who are moving west aren't moving west for freedom; they're moving west and working for these large name outfits, which is completely different from what we see in the Western movie. This is a picture of John Wayne in the movie The Searchers, and here we have cowboys as lone gunmen, right? Everybody has seen Clint Eastwood, drawing pistols against some horrible mustache twirling bad guy, and so these are the stories that we tell ourselves, but they're not accurate to the truth. They glorify this sense of violence and adventure in the American imagination, but this is really important, and this is kind of the linchpin to the argument I present in my research. Um, the myth that we've created wasn't, and in many ways still isn't, acknowledged as a myth. It's invoked as history. So if films can be history, they can do history badly. And one example presented by Toplin is a film on JFK and how this film used a lot of conspiracy theories to construct its argument. Uh, and that's very interesting that these might still be history, just history that isn't done well. And if you are a history major, or even if you aren't, you've probably had the opportunity to read a book that has an argument that's way out of left field, that is completely inaccurate to the information that's around. And this is the case with a lot of Western movies. They're viewed as history, but aren't they aren't presenting an argument that's accurate to the time period. They're presenting an argument that's glorifying a very vicious period of American history that downplays some of the racism or justifies the racism of expansion westward, and that creates a hero that never really existed. And so now we have to talk about what the overall effects of that are. So this image, I wanted to take up an entire slide, and we're going to talk about myth as history here. This is an image from the movie Birth of a Nation, which, for those of you who don't know, this film is widely regarded as, at least in film history, a masterpiece. Not because it's in any way good, but because of how it's made. Birth of a Nation is, and at the time was, very well made, and it was made and constructed around a racist argument. The creator, a man by the name of D.W. Griffith, grew up in the South, and he presents his argument for the Ku Klux Klan as a force for good in the South, as a sort of valiant police force who is creating order out of chaos and protecting a way of life, and really kind of buying into this myth of the lost cause. And this film was actually the first one shown in the White House, and very famously, the president at the time, President Woodrow Wilson, after seeing it, was quoted as saying, "It was like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is all so true." And so here we see a myth that is presented as history, and the harm it causes is felt, I mean, immediately after release. This film is released in New York, Chicago, several other big cities, and it leads to massive riots because this is a racist film. It's horrible with the arguments it's presenting and the caricatures it's presenting of African Americans. It is truly awful. And yet it is presented, and even the creator insists that it is true to history. Um, so that really shows that these myths are dangerous, especially because the line between myth and history is often turning on the idea of belief and mass belief. The more people believe in a myth, the more it's perceived as actual history, and so it is not a good thing to look at myth as history. So now we need to talk about the breakdown of that myth. And I argue that that begins with the growing popularity of the neo-Western. In 2007, No Country for Old Men, that's a picture of Javier Bardem, who's an excellent actor in that movie, and then the Coen brothers who directed it. It won an award for Best Picture, which is interesting considering that in Scott Simon, we had talked about him a little earlier, he presented an argument all the way back in 1911 that the Western was on its way out. And that was an argument from a newspaper. Um, and so the Western has a long shelf life, but it seems to be dying off. And now all of a sudden in 2007, we have this strange type of Western, this Western that I define in my paper as the qualities of the old Western, but then transposed onto the modern day. And it's much more complex because of that. Um, So after No Country for Old Men, we have something called the Frontier Trilogy. This is led by screenwriter Taylor Sheridan, and it's these three movies are what I examine in my paper. It includes the movie Sicario, which is about the war on drugs, the movie Hell or High Water, which is about two brothers robbing banks in Texas to pay off a mortgage on their farm following the housing crash, and the final movie is the movie Wind River, which follows a situation of a situation of violence against a Native American woman, and the attempt to hunt down the people who commit this act. And these movies all have similar themes. Everything in this genre deals with things like uncertainty. Um, they deal with the fallout of years of talking about Native Americans as, faceless bad guys, or the idea of the noble savage. They're trying to come to terms with this history, and with this history that's been filmed and presented as history, even though it's false. So with that, we have to talk about the new Cowboys, because they are central to the Westerns, and they're often uncertain. Here we have a picture from the movie Sicario of the main character moving through a tunnel in between Texas and Mexico. This entire movie is filled with questions about the law and about right and wrong, and these are questions that are going to be throughout Sheridan's trilogy. Um, and with that come ambiguous lawmen who don't know what right or wrong is. In Hell or High Water, the sheriff doesn't quite know how to enact justice on his partner's killer, who was shot, but whose brother, the main character of the film, got away. And so there's questions of that, and there's also violence even in the contemporary day. And here Sheridan is arguing that the violence of the Old West never really went away. It's always been there. Um, it's always been in the background of this land, and it's very tied to the land. And that's a really interesting argument because it seems to be an attempt to wrestle with these questions. Um, and that brings me to the point of it all. So these two kids in the left-hand picture, that's my brother Brock with the ball and me with the pistol, and then on the right, that's also me. These are pictures of playing Cowboys as a kid. This is a American experience, I think. At least for me living in the Midwest, it was, and for several of my friends, I think they would agree with that. The idea of the cowboy is still mass marketed. We're still coming to terms with it. And even in neo-Westerns, the cowboy is still a a force for, if not good, a force for morality, even if that's still a little gray. There are different tropes that are reinforced by these movies. Tropes of the white male lead. In all three of these movies, we don't see any Native Americans in the lead role. We see a woman in the lead role only in one of the movies, and she still fulfills what in the Old West is a traditionally masculine role, the role of the lawman. And so these these tropes aren't going away per se. They're just now starting to be discussed. And so I think that's important because as kids, at least as a kid, I always learned about the value of the Old West, about, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. And if we're going to start to question this group or this list of events that we all agree upon, we have to be willing to come to terms with the crimes that actually happened in this day and age. And finally, I want to present one last argument about the neo-Western. This is the final shot from the film Wind River. And here we see on the right-hand side there is the main character, and on the left-hand side is the father of the girl who was killed. And as you can see in the shot, they're framed by this swing set. The land is towering over them, and the highway runs across the screen. They're still in the Wild West, but it's a Wild West that's been dotted with the contemporary world. And these are two men who are lost in that. And this is the truth of the West today. As times change, our sense of history changes with it. And that can leave us all with this sense of disconnect. But only by being willing to walk through that can we ever get to anything that even resembles the truth. And as we've seen through movies that are myths presented as truth, it's dangerous not to. So it's important for us to actually reckon with these ideas of what history is and what it should be. Thank you very much for your time.